Welcome to Planet Possible's MiniPod, a 15-minute monthly update where we react to current events in water, climate and nature. I'm Niki Roach, and each MiniPod I'm joined by an environmental expert to explore issues that are making the headlines, keeping you right up to date with what's happening around the world and where my guest sees exciting possibilities. And today we're joined by the Guardian newspaper's Biodiversity correspondent Phoebe Weston, and we'll be discussing why honeybees are not necessarily good for ecosystems and the Italian island that's banned them, China's carbon dioxide emissions that fell by 1% in the final quarter of 2025, and a radical project in Belgium that's turning off streetlights to preserve wildlife. So welcome to the MiniPod, Phoebe. Great to have you back with us.
Hi Niki, good to be here.
So let's get straight into our first story. And this is a piece in The Guardian this week about why honeybees are not necessarily good for ecosystems and what Belgium and Italy are doing about it. And I must confess I was surprised by that as a headline. So tell me more.
I was in southern Belgium in a town called Chimay, where they've got this amazing project to revive this native subspecies of the honeybee, which is called the European dark bee. Now, I think there's a misconception, which lots of people have, that honeybees are good for ecosystems because they're pollinators. And certainly in London, where I live, there's been a lot of excitement about businesses having hives on their roofs and people getting honeybees in their garden, and they're kind of doing their bit for biodiversity. But actually, the reality is much more complex than that. And in this town in Belgium, they are trying to get rid of the hybrid honeybee, so it's Apis mellifera, and trying to revive the European dark bee. They think there's around 24 honeybee subspecies. This is one of them, and this is the one in Belgium and other parts of Europe, which would have been there before the hybridized bee came in. Since the last ice age, there's been these honeybee subspecies around Europe. And then middle of the last century, beekeepers found that this hybrid honeybee was much more productive, produced more honey, and people want to produce as much honey as possible. So they imported this, the guy I spoke to called it the mongrel honeybee. It's also called the buckfast honeybee. It's not native to this region, but it's a number of different species mixed together to make the most productive honeybee we can have. Essentially, they've created this area in Chimay, which is a European dark bee only area, where they're trying to revive this native bee, which is holding on in parts of Europe, but has basically gone extinct in many places, because when the hybridized honeybee was brought in, they interbred with these European dark bees. They lose their genetic purity, essentially. So this amazing project is to bring them back. And in this area around Chimay, I think there's between 50 to 100 honeybee keepers who just keep the European dark bee, and they sell European dark bee honey, and they're very proud of this effort. And what's fascinating is that other beekeepers from around Europe who want to also revive the European dark bee are bringing in their queens to be mated each summer to spread those genes around Europe and hopefully kind of start the revival of this very endangered bee.
It's an interesting choice to make, to say, actually, we're going to go away from something that is bred for a certain purpose back into this.
There's benefits to ecosystems. The guy I spoke to was called Hubert Gerriet, who's a Belgian beekeeper and biologist who's been really pivotal in maintaining the dark bee populations in this area. And he likened the dark bee to a Swiss watch in terms of its relationship with nature. Our pollinators are perfectly designed to pollinate the flowers of their region. This means that they provide optimum pollination for the flowers, and also the flowers sustain them. So it's a mutually, this relationship has developed over thousands of years. So it's good for the ecosystem to have these truly native pollinators there, not the hybridized pollinator. And secondly, in terms of the beekeeper's benefit, many beekeepers, the reason they changed to the hybridized bee was because it was more productive. But research suggests that there could be benefits for the beekeepers as well. So there's been a number of issues within the honeybee keeping community, including invasive Asian hornets, mass colony die-offs. I've reported on that from the US, and also climate change, because our weather is more unreliable. For example, in this area of Belgium in 2024 was a very wet summer, and the hybridized honeybee keepers produced very little honey. But the dark bee honeybee populations were much more resilient to fluctuations in weather. It's possible they're also more resilient to the invasive Asian hornet. It's possible that as the conditions get harder for beekeepers, these kind of native species which are so familiar with this region could be more robust than the imported species. So that is the potential benefit to beekeepers. The obvious downside is the fact that these bees don't produce the quantity of honey that the hybridized bee does. Again, Hubert was a great one for analogies, and he likened it to having a dairy cow relative to a Scottish Highland cow in terms of the production that they could make. But of course, as I mentioned, there are many benefits to having them.
Really fascinating. I wonder, actually, as somebody who rather likes a bit of honey on my porridge, whether it tastes any better as well.
Apparently it tastes the same, Niki. I'm sorry. Don't think there's much difference in the taste, but certainly people who want to support good beekeeping practices do look out for the dark bee label in this area of Belgium.
So the piece that I picked out that I thought I'd share with you is a piece by Carbon Brief, and I guess it depends how you spin this, really. There is a positive and a negative. So we know that China are a massive global emitter of carbon dioxide. They are the largest. And the IEA data for 2023 shows that China accounted for 32% of global emissions. And of that 32%, almost 80% are from burning fossil fuels, basically coal, oil, natural gas. So that's the context of this. However, the positive is that in the last quarter of 2025, their total emissions fell by 1%. And across the whole of the year, they fell by 0.3%. And this is now a 21-month long trend of consistently flat or falling emissions. So I thought it was worth pointing out, because we often, when we have the kind of climate debate, sort of talk about what about China, for good reason, in that it's a massive emitter, but actually turning, the tanker, if you'll excuse the analogy, on emissions can take some time. And I think what's interesting is if we dig into it a little bit, what China are doing is sowing the seeds for continued reduction. That said, their own 5-year plan was to reduce it by 18% by 2030, and they are obviously way off that at the moment. They'd need to reduce it now by almost a quarter in order to hit that. But I thought it was really interesting that there is a kind of long-term ambition, and we're seeing the fruits of that now coming out in terms of falling carbon emissions, albeit from the largest emitter globally, really.
And are they doing this for environmental reasons? What's driving them to do this?
Well, they're a signatory to the Paris Agreement. So arguably, I guess that you would hope is what's driving it, where you are seeing reductions. It's things like cement production, which is interesting, building materials, transport plus power. Coal's down by 1.7%. And I wonder whether there is, almost a bit like the honeybee example we've just talked about, whether there's a bit around resilience here. So power is the largest emitter of carbon dioxide for China. Electricity demand has gone up, I don't even know how to quantify this, 520 terawatt hours in 2025, right? So massive demand. But interestingly, they've met all of that demand by an increase in solar, wind and nuclear. So all of their national energy increases were met by being offset through renewable energy. And they've also increased storage capacity. So they've got an additional 75 gigawatts of storage, which means that they can cope with those peaks and troughs. That is often why we have coal-fired power stations, because the view is renewables can't cope with peaks and troughs. So I think there is going to be a benefit around resilience for them in this direction. And also, we talk a lot on the pod about the energy requirements for AI. So actually, if you think about China wanting their place in the world moving forward as a massive technology provider, then actually having sufficient power will probably be one of the deciding factors for success in that space. So you would hope it's driven through altruism and through the environment, and some of it may well be, but also I think there's probably something around economic resilience, really, as our hunger for power is only going in one direction, I think, isn't it? They are putting in additional capacity. So I think over the course of this year, they're going to put an additional 300 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity in again. So they are absolutely investing at scale. And having spent a little bit of time in China, the one thing that I was struck by is the scale of everything that happens in China is just, it's supersized. So actually when they go for something, They really go for it. So it will be really interesting to see whether we see that trend continuing, because it's the first time we've seen a plateau or a decline in carbon emissions without seeing an associated reduction in demand. So actually demand has gone up and emissions have still come down. A seed of positivity in a
rare bit of good climate news.
Yeah.
But that's not as fast as, many European countries are decarbonising much more quickly than that.
And it's the total emissions, isn't it, when you think about it? So there's the percentage difference, but actually 1% of China's emissions coming down makes an actual impact, doesn't it, in a way that it's harder for smaller countries to do. So I think, for me, what it does is it starts to squish the narrative a little bit, that we can say, well, what about China, actually? I think that's a really easy thing sometimes for countries to say and for leaders to say, and actually, well, China are doing something about it. It might not be as fast as we want, but it is going in the right direction.
I hear that so much when talking to people about climate, like, what can little old England do? Look at China. So that's a good article to bring up when someone says that. So
let's come to your final piece. So I said at the top, we talk about Belgium and Italy, and an Italian island that's banned bees. Just give me a quick summary of what's happened there, Phoebe, because that sounds really dramatic.
It's obviously hard to ban bees because they're everywhere. But this little Italian island called Giannutri, which looks lovely from the pictures I saw of it, is an hour from mainland Italy. And there were some honeybee keepers who put 18 hives on the island in 2018. And the national park was like, well, we've got an opportunity to close those hives and see what the impact is on native pollinators, because lots of this research on the impacts that honeybees have, we don't know for sure because these experiments are so hard to do. So this was a really rare example in which they were able to do it. And their findings, which were published last year, showed that over the 4 years after the honeybees were introduced, so since 2018, populations of the two vital wild pollinators, they were bumblebees and Anthrophora, fell by 80%. And then when the honeybees were locked up, i.e. there were no honeybees on the island, there was 30% more pollen for other pollinators, and wild bee species were seen more frequently. So that gives an indication of the benefits that it had to other pollinators when honeybees weren't around. And on the back of this study, the national park has decided to remove the hives completely.
Definitely some nuance here around bees. Obviously, we all love bees, but actually the right kind of bees in the right kind of location sounds like a key takeaway. Okay, so our final story, this is a piece that you've written on why one Belgian national park is turning off pointless streetlights. Tell me more, Phoebe.
Yeah, I love this story. And since I wrote it, I've been looking out for pointless streetlights all over the place. And there are a lot of pointless streetlights in life. It's this quite cool project in the Entre Sambre et Meuse National Park in Wallonia, southern Belgium. They essentially had this project to remove 75 pointless streetlights. Now, they judged if a streetlight was pointless if it was more than 50 metres from the nearest building. So often the lights they're removing are between sort of like little roads between villages. And it was also less than 50 metres from a Natura 2000 site. So these are the European conservation areas which are judged to be the highest value to nature. So on the one hand, there's not much human use for these lights. And secondly, they're in precious wildlife reserves, which are really important for nature. The push for this project was on the back of a growing number of studies that show how bad lights at night are for wildlife. So one study in France estimated that 2,000 billion insects are killed each year by public lighting. They either die from exhaustion or being eaten by predators. More than half of insects are active at night. Some experts argue that light pollution should be treated as a pressure on nature that is akin to habitat loss or chemical pollution. And it's something that we don't hear about that much, light pollution. If you look at a sort of satellite data of Belgium at night, it shines like a Christmas decoration. They go hard on streetlights, more so than other European countries. So it's a particularly significant problem in Belgium, although, of course, this is a global problem. And studies suggest that 80% of people on the planet live under light polluted skies.
Was there any kickback around safety? I mean, we are two women having a conversation about turning off streetlights at night, and actually I quite like to go out for a run in the evening, but I wouldn't want to run somewhere if it was pitch black. So how did they get past that?
Yeah, so that is the main objection. And I know what you mean, Nikki. If you're going for a run or a walk at night, it's nice to know there are street lights because you do feel safe. They're not removing lights in urban areas. These are in rural areas. But of course, there are people, again, want to walk between villages. So this does impact some people, although they've certainly tried to reduce the impacts on people by selecting the least contentious lights. Research on this question of safety is quite interesting. So one study which looked into the effects of reduced street lighting in England and Wales found that it was not linked with significant changes in crime or with the number of road collisions.
Certainly where I am here in Leeds, we've got sections of kind of ring road that, there's no houses. It's very unlikely anyone's going to want to walk along it at night time. And so they have those lights turned off between midnight and 6 a.m, for example. So I've seen little bits of that done. It's just interesting if they're doing it at scale. For me, almost another question is other buildings, not just roads, that, office buildings in city centres that are lit up like Christmas trees all night when there's definitely nobody in there. And you sort of think, actually, if we were serious about treating light pollution in the way that we talk about other types of pollution and have a more strategic approach to it, we might do different things. It's a really interesting thread for us to start pulling on a little bit and exploring the environmental impact of light pollution. Yeah, fascinating. Well, we'll pop links as ever to your articles in the show notes. So if people want to head to the Guardian website and check those out, then they absolutely can do. But that is sadly all we've got time for. So thank you so much for joining us, Phoebe, and sharing those stories. And thanks to you for joining us on this episode. If you don't already, then subscribe to Planet Possible wherever you get your podcasts to never miss an episode. And you can click the link in the show notes to join our mailing list and be the first to hear about new episodes and guests. So that's it, everyone. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.